Hello, my name is Merlin Ward, and welcome to the third and final day of our Latinx Culture Briefings. We are going to be discussing today healthcare. Joining me, we have Hannah and our table of experts, as well as some Sparks and Honey staff. We're discussing the signals on the screen behind us, and we'll also be sharing these signals with our human network, which consists of cultural observers and experts from around the world. We're going to cover a lot of ground today on the healthcare topic. First, we're just going to introduce some of the lay of the land of what's happening in healthcare, particularly through the lens of Latinx. Look at caregiving, the uninsured, as well as lifestyle and some mental health challenges that we've been following. But to start it off, I wanted to also share the elements of culture that have been associated with this topic from our system. And there's some interesting things happening here. The first is income gap, which I think will speak mostly to the livelihood of the community and some of the challenges that they have in terms of affording the lifestyle and the healthcare that they require. But then there's also taboo toppling, blurred responsibility, and moral imperative, which I think speaks mostly to the tension between the values of the Latinx community and also the system, the healthcare system, as well as some of the brands that are participating there. And then there's also longevity, quantified life, and data divinity, which would highlight the technological influences in healthcare that affects, I think, everyone, but has some interesting things happening with the Latinx community as we're collecting more and more data on minority groups in the healthcare system. But I wanted to ask the team as well if there was anything on there on elements of culture that they see or perhaps don't see that's surprising to them.
I don't know if it's necessarily surprising. I mean, we have a lot of conversations these days about the importance of mental health awareness, mental wellness, but seeing mind management up there and neural, both kind of speaking to, I'd be interested to see the nuances of that within the Latinx community versus other communities where perhaps there's less of a stigma around it. There's more open conversations. So just seeing mind management and neural both kind of up there, I just want to unpack that a little bit more.
I would love to see there coming up more elements of culture related to brands and the role that brands can play into a certain community and environment. So I'd love to see, for instance, brand activists or brand civil servant to see how much the companies are able to position themselves in a more active way.
So to your point too, Kevin, I'm very interested to understand whether or not wellness design is interpreted differently across culture, and how does that manifest? It's obviously a very hot topic that we've explored a lot in healthcare in general, but do those manifestations hold as much relevance for Latinx community than it does for general population?
Well, one more on the kind of the lay of the land here. Perhaps some irony happening in the space as well, which is that the life expectancy for the Latinx community is actually higher than that for the non-Hispanic white community, and that's with the exception of diabetes, which is affecting the Latinx community disproportionately. But Luke, I wanted to kind of ask you about this in particular, as this is kind of your arena. Is there anything else that's kind of surprising out of the Latinx community that might be in comparison to the rest of the population?
This does kind of cut in both directions because type 2 diabetes is very much an epidemic, and it does create an outsized burden on the Hispanic community, but yet they are clearly living longer lives. There are a few things I think we need to understand basically. The size of the household and sort of the fact that most Latinx families have older generations, maybe extended family. So there's a collectiveness, and within that collectiveness, a shared positive outlook on life. And I'm inclined to believe that less stress and a belief that things are going to be better tomorrow than they are today could lead to a longer life expectancy, but it's hard to really pinpoint what might be driving that. I hesitate to say that I'm surprised by that for that reason. Yeah. But certainly in light of diabetes, it does kind of create a tension.
Longevity out of hope, almost.
Stress can be debilitating.
Yeah, definitely. Well, on that point, on the stress point, there are some interesting things happening with regard to childbirth in the community as well. There was a study done that found essentially that compared to the previous 4 years after 2016's election, there was a 3% increase in preterm births. There was an expectation of about 68,000 preterm births in the Latinx community, and it turned out that there were in fact 2,337 more. And the exact cause is is undetermined, but there is a correlation between that and some of the politics that were introduced after 2016 as well. And we've talked just this week, of course, about the political situation in the United States and how that's affecting this community in particular. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to bring this point up in particular as it leads into the next discussion around caregiving.
This is an interesting article. I focus a lot with our clients in the general pop space around social determinants of health, which talk a lot about loneliness, food insecurity, other components. But it begs the question whether or not there should be more focus and research to understand whether there are different types of social determinants of health, especially when it comes to different populations, subpopulations in our environment, in our culture. And would something like political landscape be something of the stresses that are born out of the insecurity around that be factors that might impact social determinants of health?
Definitely. Yeah, and we'll get into the nuance of those social determinants as well.
Great. So we're going to block the next two signals together to focus on the issue of caregiving for thousands of Latin American millennials. And so there are two stories I want to tell. The first is the story of Nitzia Chama, who arrived to Los Angeles from Veracruz, Mexico. She had dreams of becoming an actress. 10 years later, she is now the primary caregiver of her grandparents. And the next story is when 53-year-old Guillermo Argueta, whose diabetes turned into cataracts, which later resulted in kidney failure. His sister realized she could not take care of him, so his daughter Lorena stepped up as the Argueta family primary caregiver. So there are some 40 million people in the United States that are considered to be family caregivers. Of the 40 million, 1 in 4 are millennials, and half of those caregivers identify as African American, Asian American, or Hispanic. And taking care of a loved one in Latino culture is something that many find honor in. In other words, to take care of a grandparent is not something I must do, but something that I want to do. And although it may be a sacrifice, Nitzia considers it to be the right thing to do. So I will put this out to our panel to dissect the future of caregiving in terms of our healthcare system now, but also this tension between the importance of family as honor and the sacrifice that carries with it as well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the family specifically, one thing we have to keep in mind is the idea that they do over-index on multi-generational households, so it comes natural because they're already living with their grandparents or parents. So once they become sick, it's a natural thing to take care of them. And also going back to the honor and what Luke was talking about of the collectivism, it's a big thing. So you never see it as a chore or something. It's something that you feel you have to do, but you love doing it at the same time.
And you want to, right?
Yeah, you
gotta
want
pay
to.
back their sacrifice.
Exactly.
They have done so much to be in the United States, offer more opportunities for you, the younger generation, and now it's your time to kind of pay that back.
It's one of the stark contrasts, and I know you give me a hard time. Living a Hispanic lifestyle as a non-Hispanic, I do find that my desire for individual time kind of flies in the face of this collective approach to life. That a white or non-Hispanic household is a collective of individuals, whereas the Hispanic household is a true collective. And we see that here, right? The idea that we make room for our older parents to come and stay with us, and we take care of them when it's time.
One of our clients, if I put the business lens on this, one of our clients that I work with works a lot in the caregiving space from the professional standpoint. There's obviously in caregiving the familial or private aspect of caregiving, and then obviously the professional outsourcing of that. So when I see a story or a stat like this, it makes me think about what is the right strategy as a professional provider. Do you then target Latin community as an opportunity, or is it something that's more impenetrable, and you put your strategy against more of maybe the Caucasian environment because of this idea of independence and wanting to outsource? And so this is a really interesting perspective to bring to how do you want to develop a strategy for, in essence, getting more acquisition in the caregiving space.
The irony of that is that if you look at the Hispanic community as a leading indicator of what happens, we know that there are a lot of people aging in the Gen Pop more than ever before with fewer resources and retirement. So if you look at what the Latino community has always done in terms of caregiving and how they've approached it and the collective mindedness, I think we're starting to see some of that play out with Gen Pop families who are trying to figure out how to make it work in a world of fewer resources than maybe they anticipated having.
It will be interesting to see, and I know we clicked through, but just specifically for the millennial generation, I mean, we actually have just launched a project on the future of caregiving and kind of what it's going to look like for millennials. And one of the biggest challenges that they face, and I think, Hannah, you kind of alluded to it about her coming for her acting career, but then having to put that on the back burner, is millennials in the workplace face increased difficulty and negativity with their employers when it comes to taking time off for family caregiving. They don't necessarily get the same kind of resources that older generations of caregivers do. So how can not just healthcare brands, but employers empower their workforce to still be able to do this when you have an increasingly aging population, especially among the Latinx community that has that familial focus?
And that speaks to the moral imperative element of culture we talked about at the top of the hour.
So from caregiving to insurance, Medicare and Medicaid are extremely important topics for Hispanics as they represent the ethnic group with the least number of people enrolled in health insurance. So in 2015, 9 million Hispanics were uninsured. Even though the Affordable Care Act helped decrease the amount, there are still about 16% who don't have health insurance. This could be because Hispanics work mostly blue-collar jobs, which don't provide sponsored health care, and even when they do, many cannot afford to pay the high premiums. So to our panel of experts, our System Q very much identify this as like the biggest issue, and tagging this to our elements of culture, radical transparency and income cap. When you think about this and the number it's affecting, what are your initial thoughts?
Honestly, for me, this really makes me think about the concept of health and wellness being more of a self-assessment of my ability to contribute versus a quantifiable measure of my blood pressure or my weight or something like that. And so maybe some people don't feel they need insurance because they feel very healthy and anticipating the cost and maybe where that money could be better spent. My own opinion, but I mean, it could be part of the problem.
I think they also they're very skeptical about the cost of insurance. They feel that although they're going to be paying money, it means more out of pockets. Going to the doctor still costs them money. So I think the cost of it still has a big impact on them choosing to get insurance because they feel although they will be getting it, they're not going to feel covered as they should.
Yeah,
So that's a big. And I think on top of the possible different culture on prevention, it might be also related to a lack of encouragement in this community to search for healthcare wellness services because of a gap of available products and services in terms of language barriers and even different developments that is still lacking into the marketplace.
Yeah, and that's why we see a lot of delay on diagnosis.
Exactly.
On things like that.
And something I've seen is that sometimes the barriers are just so great, and I've seen this in my own family and also in the work that I do. The barriers are so great, real and perceived to access and care, that it seems more viable to actually save money for those who are documented and go back to their home country and receive care there than to go and try and access services at the hospital that's down the street.
Great. So this next signal looks at California school-based health programs and their role being more pivotal now than ever before. So Northwood Elementary and other schools in the Twin Rivers School District of Sacramento are providing access to routine and preventative care for underserved populations. Roughly 300,000 California children are anticipated to be uninsured next year. And these programs are providing solutions to medical issues such as dental pain, unaddressed hearing problems, uncorrected vision, all issues that can take a major toll on our learning outcomes. So the question is here, what does the future of education as it relates to healthcare look like for Latinx children and teens?
Well, I think this speaks to, Laura, your earlier point about there needing to be advocates, whether it's brands, whether it's the public sector, stepping in and kind of pushing people to seek out these services, pushing the Latinx community to seek out these services. We did some research, I think, last year on Southern California seniors, and I know we're talking about children, but they also had a very kind of reticence to reach out, whether it was for language barriers, whether it was for cultural reasons, whether it was for the sense that it's their responsibility or their family's responsibility and not necessarily a doctor's. And even religious reasons, and putting it in Las Manos de Dios is what they referred to it as. So there's a necessity for brands to step in and be very active in encouraging this community to reach out for help, I think.
And expanding on that, is there also perhaps because of the values they have around family, is there also then a value shift around, say, the kind of the remedy or the home care or the caregiving of a family member versus having to go to a professional that also might influence the decision to go to a doctor?
Also, yeah, perhaps I actually want to talk to that point a little bit too, and I'll tag this actually first to one of our elements of culture, hack life. I think this is actually, I love this because it seems like it's finding solutions to problems in new and different ways, and it reminds me a lot of the signal we saw in our early Latinx briefings in the week, where it was the quinceañeras that were being used as ways to drive voter registration, which was a great sort of hack life example as well. When I look at this signal and I think about this community and sort of the role of authority, I wonder if there needs to be an analysis to understand who are the influencers to help inform decision making to engage in these spaces. So you talked a lot about brand, we talk a lot about hospital or government, and where is the threshold in which trust in engaging with this becomes motivating and then potentially concerning, and who are the right authorities to help drive engagement, and who are the ones that might actually drive away engagement, and how do we help to kind of identify that so that we can figure out what those strategies are to get people more engaged in the health system.
School tends to be a safe space for Latinos or for their kids. I think just thinking to the raids yesterday, but also overall, they tend to be places where you are safe from ICE, from all sorts of government interference. Your children are safe, and so also are you when you are in that building. So it seems like a great place and a place of great trust to bring the healthcare in.
All right. Well, we're going to move a little bit into the lifestyle segment. There are two signals I'm going to talk about back to back because they interrelate. The first is on the back end, right? And this is what we talked about at the top of the hour with type 2 diabetes being pervasive in the community. And the fact that the main driver for this is actually food insecure environments. And food insecure households being those that don't necessarily have access to healthy, nutritious food or are, for whatever reason, bringing unhealthy options into the home. Now, the stats is what's really interesting here in that 12.1% of Latinx community has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes versus 7.4% of the general population. So roughly 50% more, or nearly 60% more people. Now, of that 12.1%, 68% of them have been identified as living in food insecure locations, which would imply that there's a direct correlation with the diagnoses and also their access to healthy food. Now, on the back end of that, or I guess the front end of that, you see junk food and fast food being disproportionately advertised to this community. A new study found that Black and Latinx youth see advertising for sugar, fast food, and unhealthy products more often. In fact, in some cases, twice as much as other communities, and the 82% of ads spent on Spanish language television tends to be around junk foods, particularly candy. And the flip side of that coin, I guess, healthy items only comprise about 1% of all ads, as opposed to the 3% in the general population. Now, of course, brands still have to make their money and still sell their products. And so rather than focus on the brands themselves, we're going to focus more on the advertising. And as we had previously discussed this week, the Latinx community has a lot of buying power. They have money available for healthy options. So why not advertise the healthy stuff? And does that healthy stuff align with community values as well?
So I think one of the things that we have to talk about when we talk about junk food and access to junk food are food deserts. We have to talk about the fact that we are often not making healthy foods as available, in your corner, bodega. And then on top of that, there is absolutely an interest in access to healthy foods. Like how many Caribbean juice bars do you know that, of course, die away when you bring in a juice press or another large brand into a gentrifying neighborhood. There's a larger conversation that needs to happen about how we nourish ourselves and how we ensure access to good food, while also understanding that we're not just going to indefinitely make money forever by advertising unhealthy products to communities who are marginalized.
Angela, did you have a comment?
I did.
I've been thinking about a lot over the last 3 days is this idea of what's happening externally to Latinos and the things that are impacting them and the choices they're making. But when we think about food in particular and the choices they make in terms of what they take in, one piece that is more important than almost any other is the kind of cultural norms, right? The cultural norms about what is healthy, what is delicious, what do I want to feed myself. We talked about food being love the other day and how we transfer culture through food. And Latinos like rich, calorie-laden foods, regardless of what is advertised to them. So can brands make healthier versions of the things they love? I think is one place that brands can think of, and they do. The industry of healthier foods is huge. But when we think about what brands can do and how they play, what are the cultural things that are driving people to make those choices, right? Diabetes, of course, is a tremendous issue, an epidemic, to Luke's point, but I know plenty of diabetics who are like, oh, but una galletita está bien, or my blood sugar was fine this morning, and they actively make choices that go against what would be good, just because that's what they're used to eating.
So is that a mismatch of, say, their habits and food options from their homelands or their culture and the American lifestyle,
Yeah,
potentially?
potentially.
As it relates to diabetes too, I think, one, it marks occasion and culture. And the idea that diet is one of the cornerstones of managing diabetes might imply that you're going to be ostracized at those key moments. You can't participate in the ritual of the food. And to your point, Angela, the idea that I feel fine today means that I'm not going to go proactively seek out a diagnosis of something. So I may continue to eat poorly because I feel okay, and my priority is family and being part of the collective, not necessarily looking outward and thinking about the statistics and its influence on my future and maybe how I plan my day or my life.
And on top of I feel fine, I look fine, right? So many markers of poor health have to do with aesthetically how you look, right? If you're overweight, carrying around the middle, we know that tends to be an indicator of heart disease, diabetes. But for Latinos, the how we look and how we idealize what we need to look like is a very different cultural norm. It's a little plumper, a little thicker, and that's great. It's fine. I think everybody can look whatever their optimal is. But when we pair that with health, it really is something that is a tension in terms of what the aspiration is and what you should be.
One thing that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I see this, I think about, somebody mentioned social determinants earlier. And for me, this is a good example of kind of how a social determinant is impacting individual health behavior, right? And we live in a society where it's kind of the mantra is individual responsibility. And so that extends to like how we eat. We kind of place it all on the person without acknowledging the constraints and challenges around accessing certain types of food. And so I think the situation with like the food deserts is an example of like a constraint that is shaping people's choices about the food that they take, and we don't always acknowledge that. We think it's purely the person is choosing this because they want to.
Yeah, and to add to that is also we have to think about their daily routines as well. Like a lot of these people are working 2 jobs and they don't have time to go cook a meal for the family. They're going on their way, picking up food, taking that, and it's not usually. They're looking for a cheap option to feed the whole family, and it's not usually the healthiest. So, thinking about their daily routines as well.
All right, well,
I'm just gonna take this conversation around our element of culture, time poverty, because I think that has everything to do with the lack of alternatives or time.
And continuing the conversation around the behaviors, one thing that we've been following here at Sparks and Honey is this kind of idea of forest bathing and the reintroduction of nature into our lifestyles, particularly as urbanization continues to grow quite a bit. And of course, there are studies that show that your regular exposure to nature or dirt or hiking actually has positive effects on your mental status. Now, there are some disparities, though. In 2011, the National Park Service released a report that found that Latinx and Black people just visit the parks much less than white people. And that in general, the dense urban areas that we live in, like New York City or San Francisco or Chicago, usually have less access to these areas, particularly the low-income parts of the neighborhoods where the parks are less likely to appear, and the fact that if you live in one of these big urban centers, you likely don't own a car and don't travel outside of the city very often. But if the outdoors are so important, how can we help these communities access and participate in this activity, and why wouldn't they participate?
One reason they might not participate is what the natural woods, sort of the outside of the city, represent in a Latin American country is not an area of recreation but danger. So it's something that might be carried over from someone who's not born in the United States and maybe growing up with these kinds of recreational activities happening through churches, through interest groups. But a point I wanted to make earlier is that these are not one-dimensional things happening, because we have bicultural Hispanics living in the United States today who are 100% American at the same time that they're 100% Latino. So there's probably a significant number of Latinx millennials who are out there getting used gear and having these experiences and sort of checking the box without being completely all in, because maybe they can't afford to own those things, but they're still finding a way to have the experience. And
Oh, I was just going to say, I think to that point, visibility is hugely important. I mean, when you look at an ad in REI or LL Bean, I mean, it's overwhelmingly white.
Oh, yeah.
But REI, I think it was last year for their Opt Outside Day, they kind of convened a panel to how can they increase diversity, looking at African Americans, looking at Latinos, looking at Asian Americans, and even the LGBTQ plus community. So I think that's a very key point, especially with the Latinx community. I mean, the fact that it's multi-generational households, we've seen kind of the renaissance of the Great American Road Trip, in part because of this multi-generational travel trend, where it's really hard to pack 6-8 people onto a plane and travel, somewhere. So people are just piling into a station wagon, piling into an RV and going. So I think there is a very good opportunity for travel brands, for outdoor adjacent brands, to kind of lean into that multi-generational aspect, as the outdoors is something you can do as a family. You can go car camping, you can go on an RV.
That's a great point.
Add to that, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
To add to that, there has been some progress. So Latinos Outdoors, one of the groups pushing people to go to the outdoors, especially the younger millennial and Gen Z. They have brands sponsoring like Patagonia and RI also sponsoring these things to get them to go outdoors as well. So there has been some progress on that.
Matt in the back, you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm Iranian. I'm going to say that because I'm brown. I don't want anyone to be like, oh, okay. I feel like I've communicated a lot by mumbling. One of the things I'm connecting to a lot is some of this is a big immigrant experience. My parents are immigrants, and one of the things that I remember was a continuing theme for us was this feeling of insecurity, not just with our food, but with our work, with even our status inside the United States. And if that is your primary anxiety, the prioritizing a day in the woods feels so luxurious and just frivolous and completely disconnected from your everyday concerns. And just one more thing to go back to the signals about insurance. I grew up without insurance, and part of the mentality was we're just on our own together, and there's never going to be a safety net for us. So the mindset, the thought that there would be some saving grace in insurance doesn't connect, because it doesn't resonate with our sort of free-falling experience as we try to find our place in the United States.
Ben?
Yeah, just to build on that, some of the work that we've done for travel clients, one of the things that we've talked about is that for a lot of first-generation families, especially ones who are working multiple jobs, if there is a week of vacation, it's going back to see the grandparents, right? And so that is the primary vacation. And when you think about the ability to go to these great national parks in the West, I mean, if you have 1 week, it's going to be at grandma's house. It's not going to be in Zion National Park. And so maybe the opportunity there, as Kevin was alluding to, was the chance to find more bite-sized abilities to bring people out. So something that we may want to talk with our government clients about potentially is how do you, if we're not going to necessarily, if the Latinx or immigrant community can't necessarily take the week off in the woods, how about the afternoon? How do we start to introduce people in these bite-sized moments and grow those spaces such that when eventually they do reach the ability to take that week off, then they can spend it in these natural spaces where they can focus on wellness and meditation.
That's a good point. Well, at the top of the hour, we talked about one other stat, which was that the Latinx community in general is living longer and presumably is a little healthier than the average white person in America. But there are still some disparities there. The black African American community actually is not as well off as the white Americans. And similarly, as we had talked about earlier this week, the nuanced identities within Latinx, Afro-Latinx people, have actually correlated quite closely to the African American experience in terms of health. While the greater Latinx community is doing better and living longer, if you're part of the subset of Afro-Latinx, you're actually not doing as well. And I just wanted to kind of pick that apart a little bit. And how do we address the nuance in the identities of the Latinx community and rather than lump them all into one, treat them differently and appropriately in the healthcare system?
Got to recognize that Hispanic is a shared ethnicity as opposed to race. We believe that human race is not everyone's race, but the things that we can quantify from a health perspective in different communities apply throughout all Latinos. So it isn't a homogenous group, and there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that equality within the group is shared out. We can't let the headline, Latinos are doing better, guide policy and guide access for the entire group.
I think internally too, I mean, it's come up a few times in the entertainment conversation, in the identity conversation. There is some stigma, there's some colorism within the Latinx community that also has to be addressed. I think Kendra on Tuesday was talking about the specter of anti-Blackness and how that's still something that needs to be addressed across communities, not just the white community, not just the Latinx community, but across the board. So I think that's something, getting into the communities and kind of grappling with that social determinant is very essential.
And Corey?
I think there's a massive tension with this particular signal, primarily because there's two sides to this coin, and I want to acknowledge the role of the individual here, and that's the fact that it's very commonly known that especially when it comes to healthcare, people choose a lot of times based on their own bias. So they want to go to a doctor that, if I'm going to a gynecologist, I want to go to a female. If I have a certain ethnicity, I want to go to someone who mirrors that as well and can understand my needs better. And so knowing that there is all of this diversity within this group as well as other groups, and this inadvertent bias to who we choose for our care, what that ultimately then tells me is that there's a massive diversity issue that's likely the case with the healthcare providers. It's how does the healthcare providing body of people, whomever, whether it's institutions, employers, or whatever, better reflect the individuals so that there's better understanding and there's more comfort for that individual to engage with that expert.
Thank you for teeing up the next set of signals. I'm going to hand it over to Hannah.
Great. So we are spotting the next few signals together as they focus on one, medical shortages, and two, the mental health crisis at hand. So the first two signals look at the fact that there is a huge demand for psychologists in the Hispanic community. Around 86% of psychologists in the US are white. And the bigger issue here is that therapy is already a reach for certain people of certain cultures. Aside from other obstacles like cost and access to mental health services, traditionally Hispanic, Black, and Asian cultures aren't very warm to the idea of mental health counseling. And then this last signal looks at all the shortages in our healthcare system: a doctor and nursing shortage, a lack of hospital beds, and a shortage of medication. So according to data, if all Americans had patterns similar to white Americans with insurance in metropolitan areas, the US would need an additional 95,000 doctors immediately. The same report projects that by 2030, the doctor shortage is estimated to reach as high as 121,000. So how do you think our current system will transcend to accommodate both mental health support and medical support?
So I have a friend coming to personal, and I was helping him through a psychological process, and he speaks Spanish. And the only treatment available that he found, he was having trouble because he had to be through a screening of 1 hour through 20 questions in English, where he should be talking about the story of his life. So it's one good example of someone who was struggling to have access. He could pay for that, but he just couldn't find the best treatment. That it's not only about language, as we were discussing, it's also about culture. So it's also about someone who is able to understand the story. So even if I just translate the story for him, it's not enough. So we need to find parity around how these people can be understood.
Yeah,
I think
definitely. Definitely, I think that is a super important point. I mean, it's not just about access to this health care, it's about access to providers who can reflect your experience back at you. It's one thing to talk to a white therapist about the impacts of racism, the impacts of xenophobia, the impacts of all of this on your daily life. It's another, and for them to empathize with you, it's another for them to validate it and tell you, like, this is real, I'm not gaslighting you, you don't need to gaslight yourself, and here are tools to help you work through it. Similarly, when you are talking about other healthcare providers, your general practitioner, say that, we prefer a beauty standard that comes from white beauty standards, right? You have doctors who immediately lose your trust because they are going to say something fat-phobic to you. They are going to blame your food choices. They're going to put the onus on you and not pay attention to what might actually be going on under the surface.
Yeah, I think, kind of going back to our previous discussion about family-centered approaches, if that's an important technique to kind of reach Latinos and Latinx populations. This makes me think of, I used to evaluate a case management program for children with trauma history, and the model that, that we were paid to use, the therapy model, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, it was a very individual-focused kind of therapy. But what we saw when we were dealing with the families is we really needed to have a family-centered approach. So we had to develop, using our own funds, this other kind of therapy that included the family. And also, especially in the context of intergenerational trauma, it was the only approach I really could take in order to address the mental health needs of the children in that program.
Yeah, and looking at culture specifically too, it gets really hard as well, the stigma that it carries. So it gets so hard for people to go get help because they're judged as being crazy because you're going to a therapist or something like that. And I think the biggest tension comes in the millennial group that see it so normal on the American side of things, and on the Hispanic side, they're being judged, or they're telling them that it's not necessary to visit a psychiatrist or something like that. So it's hard, that tension that they're living right now.
I know you've clicked through, I'm sorry, but I want to really address the medical shortage, and really that ties to education in the community and the fact that we have significantly underrepresented communities with access to education, whether it be at the high school graduation level, college graduation. We know that Latinos take longer to get through college because they need more time. It's just an expensive proposition. They aren't having access to the top programs. They might not believe that medical school is something that is achievable for them. So is that a place that brands can play, that the government needs to play? What's that access and to funnel people into the medical field? From a attainment and ability to get it, I know that the desire to get it is there. Our research, we led a study on Gen Z a couple years ago that Jackie led, and overwhelmingly what young people said is, I want to help my community. And I want to help my community meant nursing, meant doctors, meant being police officers, social workers. They want to get into those fields, but they just can't.
So staying on the topic of mental health, new research found that undocumented Latina immigrants met the threshold for PTSD diagnosis at nearly 4 times the rate of civilian women in America. The researchers also found differences in PTSD by occupation. Women working outside the home had higher scores compared to those who stayed home to take care of children. Also, unemployed women had the lower scores. So thinking about this in the topic of mental health, how does it change when we look at it through more of a gendered perspective?
You might have some different angles for us to tackle here, and one of them might be also because the women, Latina women, are the worst paid group ever, compared to white women, compared to white men, compared to black women. So wage is something important to pay attention, and on top of all the stress caused recently because of everything immigrants.
Yeah, I also just want to name that racism is real, and you're inevitably dealing with various microaggressions in your workplace, or potentially even macroaggressions in your workplace, or on the way to your workplace, or whatever else. And so it is in no way surprising that this is getting reflected in how we're internalizing it. I love that Corey was talking earlier about how we need to do more studying and more studies to figure out what exactly are the levers at play here. But I think we also need to address the elephant in the room, which is simply that you are living in a society and in a country and in a world that does not center you and your needs and is going to show active friction around certain elements of your identity. And that is painful. And of course it's painful.
And I think you also have to dissect. So that with PTSD, there's trauma there, and is that, how much of that trauma is trauma experience here in the U.S. versus trauma that is coming from the countries that folks are immigrating from. So it's a very different experience coming here, to seek a better economic opportunity versus coming here to escape being killed in one's country. And so there's also kind of what you have to look at the history of that trauma dating back to the country of origin as well.
And all the risks now of being undocumented in this country. I mean, yesterday, scary to think about, but children being left without their parents.
And I would include the macho culture in Latino Hispanic communities, which makes women more exposed to all sorts of violence.
And yesterday, or the first day, I think on Tuesday, we talked also about the fact that it's not just the immigrants. We also have the American-born Latinx children or young people who are experiencing similar things. And I want to pick that apart separately, as we have obviously the immigrant story is one that we can point to a lot of things, probably very obvious things as to why they're experiencing this. But there's also the American-born, and they probably speak English well. They still have a lot of the cultural values and the family values that we had talked about earlier, but they're also going through this. And perhaps it's something that Corey had alluded to with just simply not having someone who understands their family and their experiences in life, and so it's difficult to find a provider that can mirror that for you. Or it's something else. I'm not quite sure what that would be, though. Maybe too poignant, sorry. I'll move into the next one.
So the next signal focuses on the El Paso shooting from over the weekend. And it felt like this article says it felt like a turning point for Latin American communities, one calling it the death of the American dream. So a couple of lines that stood out to me from these articles. First, it's quite a transition from being invisible to being visible in a lethal way. It's something new to my community. We are used to the basic darkness of racism, not this. The second one was, it's really hard to be alive as an immigrant right now and not to be sick and exhausted, she said. It feels like being hunted. So when we think of this, relating it back to healthcare, there's this connection between the physiological stress on the body. So I was thinking of dissecting that.
So hard. It's so hard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
There are studies where stress as a constant thing builds more stress. But I also wanted to point this back to the previous point about the PTSD. Mm-hmm. It is a known fact that the majority of the caregiving is done by women. So the fact that 34, whatever percent it was, of the Latino women are suffering from PTSD, who's taking care of them? There are implications in terms of the extended family and who's doing the caregiving that's going to extend across for all of these communities.
Yeah, normally they are taking care of everybody.
Yeah. And who takes care of the women?
That's a good question. I think also, so we need to talk for a second about exactly what terrorism is. In a previous life, I spent years of my life studying terrorism and asymmetrical warfare. And the reason that terrorism works is that one small act that actually has a disproportionate effect on our psyches and on our fear. And that's why it works, because it doesn't take many things in order for you to actively be afraid every day of what's coming. And that's precisely what's happening right now. And that is why we are all living in fear. It's not that it is statistically likely that we will be shot, but it is that we have to carry that around with us. And that's what makes it so powerful and terrifying, and begs the question, who's taking care of the caregivers, and how are we taking care of ourselves when we are living in this environment where we have to be constantly in fear?
I think there still is such a great divide between how we think about the connection between mind and body. And so I think more and more as we talk about issues of diversity, inclusion, discrimination, racism, I think we're challenged to think about how do our social experiences become internalized and really affect us even at the cellular level. Well, there's people looking at that, like your experiences with racism or chronic discrimination and how that impacts cell division, for example. I think we're really at a point where we're trying to make these connections so we can also, I think, make a better argument for why it's so important to address these social issues, these social experiences that we have.
Yeah, I mean, there was also reports that there were people who were shot in El Paso who were undocumented and didn't go to the hospital for care for fear of being deported shortly thereafter. And I wonder, given how many hospitals are run by large healthcare groups, if it isn't maybe finally incumbent on these organizations to say we provide care for all and we won't cooperate with ICE, or they will cooperate as to the lowest extent possible, because that could be how you kind of signal that we are a safe space and our system is designed to care for people regardless of their immigration status.
So,
Go ahead, Kevin.
follow me for just a second, sorry. So follow me for just a second. There is this fantastic court in Queens that is run by a female judge whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head, but she is fantastic. And basically it only deals with sex trafficking cases. So typically women who are street level or low level sex workers who've been arrested. They're almost entirely black, brown, or Asian. Many of them are immigrants. And typically this is where they uncover and begin to talk about and begin to help people get connected to services to help them potentially get out of these situations where they are being trafficked, where they are being taken advantage of in many cases. ICE has started showing up at courthouses. So you have people who aren't actually even empowered to talk about how they are being abused, to actually prosecute the people who have victimized them. And that is so wildly problematic. It has these fear ripple effects that affect absolutely everything.
Kevin?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think, and I don't think this is anything revelatory, but I don't think we're going to see the full effects of kind of the current climate that the Latinx community is living in for many, many years. I mean, I hope, whether it's next year, whether it's 4 years from now, once we kind of get through this darker period, the CDC, healthcare brands, hospitals are able to step in and start analyzing and dealing with the long-term effects. What does it mean that you have an entire population of people who are afraid to go to a hospital to seek out help for critical chronic conditions that they needed to check out but didn't for 4 years because of ICE? What does it mean for people living under the constant threat and the stress of deportation, of seeing their family members deported? What does it mean that this community has been kind of targeted, and what are the long-term effects of that? I really hope, looking forward, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, however kind of long that tail is, we spend a lot of time unpacking and dealing with the health implications, because I don't think it's a short-term issue by any means.
Yeah, and to that point, we've talked about quite a few things today, and it's certainly an intersectionality of many things when it comes to healthcare and wellness. There's obviously the family values and dynamics of the community itself. There's the outside influences, such as brands who are advertising certain food options or providing food options in those neighborhoods. There's the municipalities themselves and the resources they offer, whether it's court systems or parks. And then the healthcare providers as well, which we touched on, and Ben's point about potentially creating safe spaces in those. There certainly is not a silver bullet that's going to fix all of these problems, and we'd have to address them all individually and perhaps on multiple fronts. But I wanted to give it all back to you for one final thought, keeping all that in mind, along with what we've discussed with the influence that this community has had in America, as well as the identity of Latinx and the young people who are coming up through there as the largest minority group in the United States now. What are perhaps some final thoughts we can give to any brand, whether it's healthcare or not, to address the concerns and perhaps provide some kind of ease to this community in the future?
Yeah, I can jump in here.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about the clients that I work with in the specific industry of insurance and also moving into caregiving and providing of care, there's a lot of things that I flagged here around this concept of preventative care, which is not new, obviously, but an area that they're focusing on, which is trying to get ahead of the problem and manage it and stem it before it turns into something chronic. And there's no doubt that a lot of the topics we talked about today, whether it was the diabetic epidemic through food deserts or PTSD via immigration, there's clearly going to be some rich territories to analyze and help the client maybe provide resources, recommendations, et cetera, for how to get access to some of the preventative solutions earlier to avoid some of the more chronic issues that might be psychological or physiologically driven later down the road. So there's definitely a lot of rich subject matter here to float over to them.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's a huge opportunity in doing a lot of unbranded work that really gets people to educate people on certain conditions rather than putting the label on something, but really feeling like they're there to help them. So that's one big thing, unbranded work.
Great. Kevin?
Yeah, I think just building on all of that, really getting into the communities and working with them, meeting them where they're at, and finding the ways to empower them to reach out for help when they might not necessarily be willing to, where they might not necessarily feel able to, or they might even not know that they need to reach out for help. So finding the ways to really empower the community at the places that they are, rather than asking them to come to you, getting into the grassroots level.
Yeah, there's a lot of room in healthcare to educate, and I think that genuine sense of empathy to consumers goes a long way for brands. And when it's possible to sort of reflect that reality in the actual branded content, because we know that's inevitably going to come, but we're going to earn the trust and hopefully impact those communities far more through education and things that we know are immediately needed rather than product specific.
That's great. Jorge?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a point one can always make, is again, just recognizing the tension and the pros and cons of addressing the Latinx population as a homogenous group. And particularly we're seeing that there's certain, disease or conditions or health issues that affect different national groups differently. And so, taking into account the differences in, for a particular national group, take into account the differences in terms of culture, the history, the politics, the migration history, and how each of those things are going to inform the strategy you want to develop to approach that particular health issue impacting that population.
I would say that companies, they have the opportunity to work towards closing this gap that we are seeing now through their services, products, and as employers, how they can make it more real in terms of the way they work. And I will focus on two things here. First is a beauty and wellness brand that we are working right now, reskilling their workforce. It's millions of people workforce, and some of them here in the US. So we need to take into account the Latinx community culture. And also, in addition to that, the subcultures related to that, mostly when they start entering in the space of mental wellness. And in second place, I think this is a great opportunity for companies and brands in the technology space to tackle the mental wellness opportunity, providing access on services to more people.
Wonderful.
With safety.
Angela, as our final thought of the week on Latinx.
I'm going to take it at a week level, not just on healthcare. I think
Great.
the panel covered it. Brands choose purpose every day. Marilyn, I think we all talk about purpose in our brands and how can we impact the world. And if you want to have Latinos care about your brand, they're extremely brand loyal people. You get them in, but you get them in through showing that empathy by living a purpose that makes sense for their barrio, not at a high level lofty that they can't understand, but taking it to their community, to their home, to their families. How does that purpose show up in their life? I think is a way that brands need to think about connecting with the Latino community.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us on this wonderful journey this whole week for hour-long discussions on Latinx across their identity, entertainment, and healthcare. We do the briefings Monday through Thursday, and we'll continue to live stream the first 20 minutes Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. If you'd like to be a guest here in the studio and participate in our discussions, you can go to our website and sign up to be a guest online. While you're there, you may also sign up for our newsletter, Culture Bites, which is a briefing of our briefings, in which we'll also send a recap of this week. So until next week, consider yourself briefed.